long before Mahwah became a patchwork of suburban neighborhoods, corporate campuses, and preserved woodland. The land that would one day host the Crocker Mansion existed as a quiet stretch of northern New Jersey terrain shaped by ridgelines, forests, and the slow rhythms of agrarian use. And it was this landscape, positioned near the Ramapo Mountains and close enough to New York City to be accessible yet distant enough to feel secluded, that would eventually attract the attention of wealthy industrial families seeking retreat, status, and control over space. And as the 19th century progressed, this region began to shift from purely agricultural utility to recreational and residential potential, particularly for those whose fortunes were tied to the explosive growth of American industry, railroads, banking, and manufacturing. And it was within this broader transformation that the origins of the Crocker estate took shape. Not as a single deliberate act, but as a convergence of land acquisition, social ambition, and economic power. And the story of the mansion begins with the Crocker family, whose wealth traced back to the railroad empires and industrial consolidation of the late 19th century, a period when vast fortunes were assembled quickly and often translated into physical symbols of permanence, influence, and refinement. And for families like the Crockers, estates were not merely homes but statements. Carefully chosen locations where architecture, landscape design, and privacy combined to reflect both success and aspiration. And Mahwah, with its dramatic topography and relative isolation, offered the ideal canvas. And the land that would eventually become the Crocker estate was assembled through a series of purchases, consolidating parcels that had previously been farmland or undeveloped woodland, and this process itself reflected a shift in land value. As proximity to rail lines and the growing metropolitan region increased the desirability of such properties, and by the time plans for a grand residence began to coalesce, the estate was envisioned not simply as a country house, but as a self-contained environment, one that could support extended stays, entertain influential guests, and project stability across generations. And early conceptualizations of the mansion emphasized scale, craftsmanship, and alignment with architectural trends favored by America's elite, particularly those drawing inspiration from European precedents, as wealthy families sought to anchor their new money in old-world aesthetics, and architects were commissioned not just to design a building, but to orchestrate a relationship between structure and landscape, ensuring that the mansion appeared both dominant and harmonious within its surroundings. And this attention to placement was critical, as the house was positioned to command views of the surrounding hills while remaining shielded from public roads, reinforcing the dual goals of visibility and seclusion. And as construction began, the project drew upon skilled labor, specialized materials, and emerging building technologies, blending traditional masonry techniques with modern conveniences that distinguished such estates from earlier rural homes. And while details of the earliest construction phases would later be obscured by renovations and ownership changes, the initial build set the tone for the estate's identity, establishing it as a place defined by solidity, order, and controlled grandeur. And the mansion's early years under Crocker ownership were shaped by the rhythms of elite country life, marked by seasonal occupation, social gatherings, and the careful maintenance of grounds and interiors. And the estate functioned as both refuge and stay, a private retreat from urban centers and a venue for reinforcing social networks. And during this period, Mahwah itself began to feel the subtle influence of such estates, as employment opportunities emerged for local residents in roles ranging from groundskeeping to domestic service. And infrastructure improvements were often driven by the needs of wealthy landowners, gradually altering the character of the area. And yet the mansion remained somewhat insulated from the surrounding community, its boundaries clearly defined and its internal operations largely self-sufficient. And this separation reinforced the social hierarchies of the time, embedding the estate within a broader pattern of Gilded Age land use where wealth reshaped geography. And as decades passed, the estate's identity evolved alongside changes in family fortunes, national economics, and cultural expectations. And by the early 20th century, the original Crocker ownership began to give way to a new chapter, one that would bring the Macmillan name into the story. And this transition did not occur abruptly, but through the gradual transfer of property and influence, reflecting both personal circumstances and the shifting dynamics of wealth management. And the Macmillan family, themselves connected to industrial and financial success, inherited not only the physical estate but the symbolic weight attached to it. And under their stewardship, the mansion would undergo changes that reflected new tastes, priorities, and uses, while still retaining the foundational character established during its earliest years. And even in these initial phases, the mansion existed within a tension between permanence and change, built to endure yet inevitably subject to the evolving needs of its owners and the pressures of a changing world. And this tension would come to define much of its later history, as the estate navigated shifts in ownership, function, and meaning. But at this early stage, the Crocker Macmillan Mansion stood as a testament to an era when land, architecture, and wealth converged to create environments designed to last, signaling not only personal success, but a belief in the enduring power of place, a belief that would be tested repeatedly as the 20th century unfolded, and the world beyond the estate's gates transformed in ways its original builders could scarcely have imagined. As the Crocker Macmillan estate settled into its early identity, the surrounding decades brought changes that quietly reshaped both the mansion and the social world it inhabited. And while the structure itself projected stability and permanence, the lives unfolding within its walls reflected a period of adjustment, refinement, and strategic reinvention, as the Macmillan family began to assert its presence more clearly over the property. And this transition marked not a rupture with the past, but a careful layering of new priorities onto an existing foundation, with the mansion serving as both inheritance and instrument. And under Macmillan's stewardship, attention increasingly turned to modernization, not in the sense of abandoning tradition, but in adapting the estate to evolving standards of comfort, efficiency, and prestige that defined elite life in the early 20th century. And this meant renovations that were subtle yet consequential, including updates to interior layouts, improvements to heating and electrical systems, and refinements to decorative schemes that aligned the house with contemporary tastes without erasing its original character. And these changes were often invisible to outsiders, folded into the rhythms of daily life, but they signaled an important shift. As the mansion moved from being a symbol of initial acquisition and display to a lived-in environment designed for longevity and adaptability. And the grounds themselves were also subject to reconsideration, with landscaping adjusted to emphasize vistas, manage water flow, and create formal and informal outdoor spaces that reflected emerging ideas about estate planning, blending aesthetic control with a cultivated sense of naturalism. And gardens, driveways, and auxiliary structures were reconfigured to support both leisure and function, reinforcing the idea that the estate was not a static monument but a carefully managed system. And during this period, the mansion's role as a social hub expanded, hosting gatherings that reflected the Macmillans' position within broader networks of business, philanthropy, and cultural influence. And these events were not merely social indulgences but strategic engagements, opportunities to reinforce alliances, exchange information, and assert status within a competitive elite landscape. And Mahwah, while still relatively quiet, became accustomed to the presence of such activity, as the mansion's operations created a small but steady economic ecosystem, employing staff and drawing service providers from nearby towns. And this relationship between estate and community, while unequal, was symbiotic, with the mansion exerting influence through patronage rather than direct governance. And as national events began to intrude upon private life, including economic fluctuations and shifting social norms, the estate functioned as a buffer, insulating its occupants from immediate disruption while still absorbing pressure in more subtle ways, such as changes in staffing practices, maintenance priorities, and the frequency and scale of social events. And the mansion's architecture, with its thick walls, expansive rooms, and deliberate separation of public and private spaces, proved well suited to this role. Reinforcing hierarchies while allowing flexibility in use, and within the household daily life followed patterns that balanced ritual and adaptation, with formal dining, scheduled leisure, and seasonal movement coexisting alongside the practical realities of managing a large property. And the Macmillans, like many families of their class, faced the challenge of sustaining an estate originally designed for an earlier era of abundant labor and unquestioned wealth. And their responses to this challenge would shape the mansion's trajectory for decades to come. And as the early 20th century progressed, broader cultural shifts began to subtly alter the meaning of such estates, as public attitudes toward wealth, land use, and social responsibility evolved. And while the mansion remained a private residence, it could not entirely escape the changing narratives surrounding privilege and excess. And this tension manifested in choices about how openly the estate engaged with the outside world, whether through charitable events, limited public access, or discreet participation in local initiatives. And these decisions reflected a growing awareness that visibility carried risk as well as prestige. And yet, despite these pressures, the Crocker Macmillan mansion continued to project an image of continuity, its physical presence anchoring a way of life that was increasingly under scrutiny. And the estate's survival through this period depended not only on financial resources, but on the adaptability of its owners, who navigated shifting expectations with a blend of conservatism and pragmatism. And as the decades moved forward, the mansion accumulated layers of history, each renovation, gathering, and management decision adding to its identity. And while the outside world accelerated toward modernity, the estate maintained its own tempo, slower, more deliberate. Shaped by tradition but responsive to necessity. And this balance between endurance and evolution would become increasingly important as the mansion approached the mid-20th century, when forces beyond any single family's control would begin to challenge the very premise of large private estates, setting the stage for transformations that would test whether the Crocker Macmillan mansion could remain what it had been built to be, or whether it would be compelled to assume a new role entirely. As the estate moved deeper into the 20th century, the Crocker Macmillan mansion began to experience a subtle but unmistakable shift in purpose, one driven less by architectural ambition and more by the changing realities of wealth, family structure, and national circumstance. And while the house itself remained physically imposing, its role within the lives of its owners started to evolve, reflecting broader transformations affecting America's elite during this period, and the Macmillan family. Like many others who inherited grand estates built during the Gilded Age, found themselves balancing reverence for legacy with the practical demands of upkeep, staffing, and relevance. And this balance was increasingly difficult to maintain as economic pressures mounted and social expectations shifted. And inside the mansion, rooms once designed for frequent entertaining were used more selectively, with large gatherings becoming less common and more intentional. And this was not merely a matter of taste but of necessity, as maintaining a full domestic staff and hosting lavish events required resources that were no longer taken for granted, even among the wealthy, and the estate's operations became more streamlined, with roles consolidated and schedules adjusted to reflect a more restrained mode of living. And yet, despite these changes, the mansion did not retreat into obscurity, as it continued to serve as a symbol of continuity and stability, both for the family and for the surrounding community, which had grown accustomed to its presence as a landmark of local identity. And during this era, Mahwah itself was changing, with improved transportation links and gradual population growth bringing new attention to the region, and the estate's once isolated setting became incrementally more connected to broader patterns of development. And this proximity introduced new considerations regarding land use, privacy, and long-term planning. As the value of large tracts of land increased and pressures for subdivision or sale emerged, And the Macmillans, aware of these dynamics, approached the estate with a mixture of caution and strategic foresight, recognizing that preserving the property in its entirety might not always align with economic reality. And yet, any decision to alter the estate's boundaries or function carried symbolic weight, potentially signaling a retreat from the ideals that had motivated its creation. And this internal tension was mirrored in the physical maintenance of the mansion, where repairs and updates were increasingly guided by practicality rather than display, with emphasis placed on structural integrity, efficiency, and adaptability, and technological advancements continued to be incorporated, including improvements to plumbing, electrical systems, and communication infrastructure, ensuring that the house remained functional by contemporary standards. Even as its aesthetic remained rooted in an earlier era, and these upgrades were often executed discreetly, preserving the outward appearance of timelessness while quietly acknowledging the inevitability of change. And within the household, generational dynamics played a significant role in shaping the estate's future, as younger family members brought different perspectives on wealth, responsibility, and lifestyle. And while some viewed the mansion as a treasured inheritance to be preserved at all costs, others questioned whether such a property could realistically serve the needs of modern life, and these differing viewpoints did not necessarily result in immediate conflict, but they introduced a gradual shift in how the estate was perceived, moving it from unquestioned centerpiece to subject of deliberation. And as national events, including economic downturns and social upheavals, exerted pressure on established hierarchies, the mansion stood as both refuge and reminder, offering physical security while symbolizing a social order increasingly challenged by calls for reform and redistribution. And the estate's relative insulation from these forces was not absolute, as financial markets, tax policies, and labor relations all influenced its viability, and decisions about staffing levels, land management, and capital investment were shaped by external conditions as much as internal preference. And yet, through all of this, the Crocker Macmillan mansion retained a sense of gravitas, its architecture and setting reinforcing the idea that some things endured despite uncertainty, and this perception was carefully maintained, not only through physical upkeep, but through the cultivation of narrative, as family histories, anecdotes, and traditions were preserved and passed down, reinforcing the mansion's status as a repository of memory as well as property. And this emphasis on continuity served a psychological function, anchoring identity in a period of flux. And even as the estate's day-to-day operations became more modest, its symbolic importance remained potent, and the grounds continued to be managed with an eye toward preservation, maintaining the visual coherence that had defined the estate since its inception. And trees planted decades earlier reached maturity, paths settled into familiar patterns, and the landscape itself became a record of time, reflecting choices made long ago and reaffirmed through ongoing care. And as the mid-century approached, it became increasingly clear that the mansion's future would depend on adaptability as much as inheritance. And while no single moment marked a definitive turning point, the accumulation of small decisions gradually repositioned the estate within a changing world, setting the stage for more significant transformations that would test the limits of tradition and challenge assumptions about what it meant to own, maintain, and justify such a property. And in this way, the Crocker Macmillan mansion entered a phase defined less by expansion or display and more by negotiation, between past and future, between symbolism and practicality, and between the desire to preserve and the necessity to evolve. A negotiation that would only intensify as the century advanced, and the forces shaping American life grew ever more complex. By the time the Crocker Macmillan mansion moved fully into the middle decades of the 20th century, the estate existed in a strange in-between state, neither frozen in its original Gilded Age purpose, nor fully transformed to suit the modern world that was steadily encroaching upon it. And this liminal quality defined much of its daily reality, as the mansion remained outwardly grand while internally adjusting to a society that no longer revolved around private estates as centers of power. Culture or economic gravity and the rhythms of life within the house slowed, becoming more introspective and controlled, shaped by an awareness that excess for its own sake was increasingly viewed with suspicion rather than admiration. And this awareness influenced everything from how spaces were used to how the family presented itself publicly. And while the mansion still hosted guests, these gatherings were quieter, more selective, and often centered on family, trusted associates, or charitable causes rather than social spectacle, reflecting a broader redefinition of prestige that favored discretion over display. And this shift was mirrored in the surrounding region, as Mahwah and the wider northern New Jersey area experienced post-war growth, suburban expansion, and infrastructural development, drawing new populations and altering the social landscape in ways that made large, self-contained estates feel increasingly anachronistic. And roads improved, nearby towns expanded, and land that had once been considered remote gained new economic relevance, placing the Crocker Macmillan property under growing external scrutiny. And while the estate remained private, its scale and location inevitably attracted attention from developers, planners, and local officials who saw potential in land that had long been shielded from commercial pressures. And these external interests introduced a new layer of complexity to decisions about the estate's future, as maintaining the property in its original form now required not only financial resources, but active resistance to forces pushing for subdivision or repurposing. And internally, the mansion's maintenance entered a phase of prioritization rather than perfection, as systems were repaired and updated selectively, focusing on what was essential rather than what was ornamental. And while the architectural integrity of the house was respected, there was less emphasis on constant restoration and more on sustainability, ensuring that the building could continue to function without draining resources unnecessarily. And this pragmatic approach reflected changing attitudes toward wealth stewardship, where responsibility and restraint were increasingly valued over lavish upkeep. And yet, even as efficiency became a guiding principle, the emotional attachment to the mansion remained strong, reinforced by decades of family memory embedded in its walls, rooms, and grounds. And this attachment complicated any purely rational assessment of the estate's value or purpose, as decisions were filtered through personal history and a sense of obligation to past generations. And the mansion's interior spaces bore quiet witness to these tensions, with rooms retaining their original proportions and character, while adapting subtly to new uses, such as formal rooms becoming quieter living spaces or rarely used areas being closed off to conserve resources. And the estate's staff structure also reflected this transition, as the large domestic teams once required to operate the mansion were reduced, replaced by smaller, more versatile crews capable of handling multiple responsibilities. And this change altered the social dynamic of the household, creating a more intimate environment that contrasted sharply with the hierarchical systems of earlier decades. And beyond the mansion itself, the surrounding land took on new significance, as questions arose about conservation, land management, and long-term viability. And the natural landscape, once shaped primarily for aesthetic pleasure and privacy, began to be viewed through the lens of environmental value and potential preservation, aligning with emerging mid-century attitudes toward land stewardship. And this perspective positioned the estate not only as a private holding, but as a potential asset to the broader community, should circumstances ever necessitate a change in ownership or function. And during this period, the mansion's symbolic role evolved, becoming less a statement of personal dominance and more a reminder of a bygone era, its presence prompting reflection on how wealth, power, and architecture had been expressed in the past, and how those expressions were being reinterpreted in the present. And historians, architects, and local observers began to take note of the estate as an example of early 20th century design and social ambition, even if formal preservation efforts had not yet materialized. and this growing awareness planted the seeds for future debates about historical value versus economic practicality, debates that would intensify as the century progressed. And through all of this, the Crocker Macmillan Mansion endured, not through stagnation, but through careful, often cautious adaptation. Its survival depended on a series of measured choices that balanced respect for its origins with acknowledgement of an irrevocably changed world. And as the estate moved forward, it carried with it the weight of accumulated decisions, each one shaping not only its physical condition, but its place within a society that was steadily redefining what such grand private spaces could and should represent, setting the stage for the more decisive challenges and transformations that lay ahead. As the decades advanced and the Crocker Macmillan Mansion moved deeper into the latter half of the 20th century, the pressure that had once lingered quietly at the edges of the estate began to assert itself more directly, transforming abstract concerns about the future into concrete challenges that could no longer be deferred. And this shift marked a decisive turning point in the mansion's long existence. As external forces now actively shaped its fate rather than merely influencing it from a distance, and the surrounding region of Mahwah was changing rapidly, driven by population growth, expanding transportation networks, and an increasing demand for land suitable for residential and commercial development. And what had once been considered an isolated enclave of wealth and privacy was now situated within a landscape of opportunity for developers whose interests stood in sharp contrast to the preservation of a single sprawling estate. And as land values rose, the mansion's acreage became a focal point of attention, its size representing both its greatest strength and its most significant vulnerability, and discussions about zoning, subdivision, and potential sale began to surface with greater frequency, sometimes discreetly and sometimes openly, reflecting a broader societal shift in which historic estates were increasingly viewed through the lens of economic optimization rather than cultural continuity. And within this environment, the stewardship of the Crocker Macmillan property demanded not just financial commitment but strategic foresight. As decisions made during this period would determine whether the mansion could continue to exist as a unified entity, or whether it would be gradually dismantled through incremental concessions. And these decisions were complicated by rising maintenance costs, evolving tax structures, and the sheer logistical burden of sustaining a property designed for an era of vastly different economic assumptions. And while the mansion itself remained structurally sound, its systems aged, requiring significant investment to meet modern standards of safety, comfort, and efficiency, and each necessary upgrade forced a reevaluation of priorities, as the balance between preservation and practicality grew increasingly delicate. And inside the house, this tension manifested in subtle but telling ways, with certain rooms seeing less use, others being repurposed, and some original features preserved more for their symbolic value than for daily function. And the house began to feel less like a living organism, and more like a carefully managed artifact, still inhabited but increasingly conscious of its own fragility within a changing world. And the emotional weight of this transition was considerable, as the mansion had long served not only as a residence, but as a repository of family identity, memory, and continuity. And confronting the possibility of its alteration or loss required grappling with the meaning of legacy itself. And this internal reckoning mirrored a broader cultural moment in which many families of old wealth faced similar questions. As the structures that had once embodied their social standing became burdensome in a society that no longer rewarded inherited grandeur in the same way, and outside the estate, public perception of such mansions was also evolving, with some viewing them as irreplaceable historical treasures, and others seeing them as symbols of inequality or inefficiency. And this divided perception influenced local discourse, shaping how proposals involving the estate were received by the community. And while formal preservation movements were gaining traction nationally, their application at the local level was uneven, often dependent on advocacy, political will, and public interest. And during this period, the Crocker-Macmillan Mansion occupied an ambiguous position, recognized by some for its architectural and historical significance, but not yet fully protected by robust preservation mechanisms. And this ambiguity left it exposed to shifting priorities and opportunistic proposals. And as discussions about the estate's future intensified, they revealed underlying tensions between private ownership rights and communal interest, between economic development and cultural conservation, and between progress and remembrance. And navigating these tensions required careful negotiation, as outright resistance to change risked isolation. While uncritical acceptance of development threatened irreversible loss, and the mansion's fate became increasingly intertwined with broader conversations about land use, historical responsibility, and the values that would define the region's growth. And through it all, the house itself remained a silent constant, its walls bearing witness to deliberations that would shape its destiny without its consent. And the grounds, once designed to insulate the mansion from the outside world, now served as contested territory, their openness both a practical concern and a symbolic one, representing the permeability of even the most fortified legacies. And as the period drew on, it became clear that the Crocker-Macmillan Mansion could not remain untouched by the forces surrounding it, and that its survival would depend not on isolation but on adaptation, advocacy, and a reimagining of its role within a modern context, setting the stage for choices that would ultimately redefine not just the estate itself, but its relationship to history, community, and the future. As the pressures surrounding the Crocker-Macmillan Mansion intensified, the estate entered a phase defined less by grandeur and more by negotiation, recalibration, and quiet endurance. And this period marked a subtle but profound transformation in how the mansion functioned within both private and public spheres, as it increasingly became a subject of discussion among planners, historians, and local officials, rather than simply a secluded residence known only to its occupants and invited guests. And the reality that the mansion could no longer exist entirely on its own terms forced a reevaluation of its purpose, not just as a home, but as a piece of land, an architectural artifact, and a historical symbol. And this reevaluation unfolded gradually, shaped by a series of incremental decisions rather than a single dramatic turning point, each choice narrowing or expanding the range of possible futures available to the estate. And during this time, conversations about partial development began to surface more concretely, with proposals that suggested carving off sections of the surrounding land while preserving the main house, an approach framed as a compromise between preservation and progress, yet one that carried its own risks, as altering the estate's original boundaries threatened to erode the contextual integrity that gave the mansion much of its meaning. And supporters of such ideas argued that adaptation was necessary for survival, while critics warned that fragmentation would ultimately hollow out the estate's historical value. And these debates highlighted a central dilemma faced by many large historic properties in the modern era, where the scale that once signified prestige now represented liability. And internally, the stewardship of the mansion required increasingly professionalized management, with legal advisors, tax specialists, and preservation consultants becoming as essential as household staff. And the language surrounding the house shifted accordingly, moving away from familial narratives toward terminology rooted in assets, liabilities, and compliance. And while the mansion still retained its aesthetic power, its continued existence depended on spreadsheets and zoning maps as much as on stonework and craftsmanship. And this shift was not without emotional cost, as it reframed the house from a lived-in environment into a strategic concern, something to be defended, justified, and optimized rather than simply inhabited. And yet, even as the mansion became more entangled in bureaucratic processes, there remained a deep awareness of its intangible value, the sense that it embodied a chapter of American history that could not be replicated or replaced. And this awareness fueled efforts to document, catalog, and interpret the estate's features in greater detail, leading to surveys that recorded architectural elements, landscape design, and interior finishes with a level of precision that acknowledged their potential vulnerability. And these efforts served a dual purpose, both preserving knowledge for future generations and strengthening arguments for the mansion's significance in the face of development pressures. And at the same time, the broader cultural climate was becoming more receptive to historic preservation, influenced by growing public interest in heritage tourism and a reassessment of the architectural legacy of the Gilded Age. And this shift created new opportunities for the mansion to be viewed not merely as a private concern, but as a shared cultural resource, though translating that recognition into tangible protection remained a complex process, requiring alignment between private owners, local authorities, and preservation organizations. And this alignment was often difficult to achieve, as each stakeholder brought different priorities and constraints to the table. And negotiations were further complicated by the mansion's location, which placed it at the intersection of suburban expansion and environmental conservation, with its wooded grounds representing both a desirable development site and a valuable ecological buffer. And this dual identity added another layer to discussions about its future, as environmental considerations began to intersect with historical ones, broadening the scope of what preservation might mean. And within this context, the mansion's narrative began to expand beyond its origins, incorporating themes of land stewardship, community identity, and responsible growth. And this expanded narrative offered a way to reframe the estate's relevance, positioning it as a lens through which broader societal values could be examined, rather than as an isolated relic of wealth. And still, despite these conceptual advances, the practical realities remained daunting, as the costs associated with maintaining the mansion continued to rise. Driven by the need for specialized restoration work, compliance with evolving safety codes, and the simple wear and tear of time on a structure of such scale, and each repair project required careful deliberation, balancing authenticity against durability, and deciding when to replicate original materials and when to discreetly incorporate modern solutions, and these decisions accumulated, gradually shaping the mansion's physical character in ways that reflected contemporary priorities as much as historical ones. And throughout this period, the house itself continued to exert a quiet influence, its presence anchoring discussions and reminding all involved of what was at stake. And walking through its rooms, one could still sense the intentionality of its design, the way spaces flowed into one another, the alignment of windows with views of the landscape, and the subtle hierarchies embedded in its layout. And these qualities underscored the argument that the mansion was more than the sum of its parts, that its significance lay not just in individual features but in the cohesive vision they collectively expressed. And preserving that vision in a changing world required more than nostalgia. It demanded adaptability, collaboration, and a willingness to redefine what preservation could look like. And as this phase drew to a close, it became evident that the Crocker Macmillan Mansion was entering a new chapter, one in which its survival would depend on its ability to engage with the present without severing its ties to the past. And the choices made during this time would resonate far beyond the estate's boundaries, influencing how similar properties might navigate the same uncertain terrain in the years to come. By the years when the Crocker Macmillan Mansion had fully settled into the landscape of Mahwah, its presence no longer felt like a novelty, but rather like an immovable force that shaped everything around it, a structure that dictated roads, views, and even the rhythm of local life. And this phase of its history marked a subtle but important shift from pure construction ambition to lived reality. Because the estate was no longer just an idea manifested in stone, but a functioning world unto itself, complete with routines, hierarchies, and quiet rituals that unfolded daily behind its walls. And during this period the mansion operated less as a showpiece and more as a carefully managed organism, with staff rising before dawn to tend to fires, kitchens, and grounds, while the main house slowly came to life in a way that mirrored the industrial discipline that had created the wealth funding it. And this was also the era when the estate's scale became fully apparent to outsiders, as visitors approaching from the winding roads of northern New Jersey encountered not a single building but an entire domain, where the main house dominated the hilltop while secondary structures, carriage houses, service wings, and landscape gardens spread outward in deliberate symmetry, creating a sense of separation from the surrounding world that was both physical and psychological. And for those invited inside the mansion during this time, the experience was designed to be overwhelming in a quiet, controlled manner, as rooms unfolded one after another with an almost theatrical packing, each space reinforcing the message that this was not merely a residence, but a statement of permanence, authority, and cultivated taste. And yet beneath that polished surface, there existed an ongoing tension between grandeur and practicality. Because maintaining such a vast property required constant effort, expense, and adaptation, particularly as modern conveniences continued to evolve at a rapid pace during the early 20th century, forcing the estate's managers to integrate new technologies without disrupting the carefully curated aesthetic that defined the mansion's identity. And so electrical systems were refined, heating methods adjusted, and communication tools quietly installed, all while ensuring that the illusion of timeless elegance remained intact for anyone passing through the grand halls or dining rooms. And it was during this same period that the surrounding community began to view the mansion not just as a wealthy enclave, but as a landmark that influenced local development, employment, and even regional reputation, because the estate provided work for dozens of people directly and indirectly, from gardeners and stable hands to craftsmen and suppliers, creating an economic ecosystem that tied the mansion to Mahwah in ways that were rarely acknowledged publicly but deeply felt behind the scenes. And as the years passed, social gatherings hosted at the mansion reflected broader shifts in American society, as formal dinners and carefully choreographed receptions coexisted with a growing awareness that such displays of wealth were becoming increasingly scrutinized in a country grappling with labor movements, economic disparities, and changing cultural values. And while the Crocker and Macmillan families continued to entertain guests from similar social circles, there was an unmistakable sense that the world beyond the estate gates was changing faster than the traditions preserved within them. And this contrast became especially apparent during moments of national uncertainty, when news from outside filtered into the mansion through newspapers and conversations, reminding its inhabitants that even a fortress of stone and money could not fully insulate itself from broader historical forces. And yet the mansion persisted in projecting stability, with its architecture serving as a visual reassurance that some things were meant to endure regardless of shifting political or economic tides. And this belief in endurance was embedded in everything from the thickness of its walls to the careful preservation of its interiors, where furnishings were maintained, artworks curated, and spaces used in ways that reinforced continuity rather than novelty. And as children grew up within the estate's boundaries, their experiences were shaped by an environment that blended privilege with isolation, offering freedom to roam vast grounds while simultaneously reinforcing a sense of separation from ordinary life. And these formative years contributed to the evolving narrative of the mansion as not just a symbol of wealth, but as a setting where personal histories unfolded quietly, away from public attention. And at the same time, the estate's relationship with nature became increasingly significant. As landscaped gardens matured, trees reached their intended heights, and vistas originally imagined on architects' drawings finally took their full form, creating a dialogue between the built environment and the surrounding Ramapo Mountains that softened the mansion's imposing presence and anchored it more firmly to the land. And this harmony between architecture and landscape was no accident, as it reflected a broader philosophy common among elite estates of the era, one that sought to present wealth as refined stewardship rather than raw dominance, even if the reality beneath that presentation was far more complex. And as this phase of the mansion's life progressed, subtle signs of future challenges began to emerge, not as dramatic crises, but as quiet questions about sustainability, relevance, and purpose. Because maintaining such a property required a level of commitment that extended beyond any single generation, and the unspoken issue of what the mansion would become in the decades ahead lingered in the background, even as daily life continued with an air of confidence and routine. And it is within this atmosphere of stability, tinged with uncertainty, that the Crocker Macmillan Mansion entered the next stage of its history, carrying forward all the weight of its origins while standing unknowingly on the threshold of transformation. A transformation shaped not by immediate events, but by the slow, relentless passage of time and the changing values of the world beyond its gates. By the time the Crocker Macmillan Mansion moved deeper into the middle decades of the 20th century, the sense of inevitability that had quietly hovered around the estate began to solidify into something more tangible, because the world outside Mahwah was no longer merely changing in tone or pace, but undergoing structural shifts that challenged the very logic upon which estates like this had been built. And although the mansion itself remained physically unchanged, its role within society started to feel increasingly ambiguous, as if the building was waiting for instructions that no longer arrived as clearly as they once had. And this period was defined less by dramatic events within the estate and more by a gradual recalibration of how the mansion fit into a nation redefining wealth, power, and legacy. And within the walls of the house, daily routines continued with practiced precision, but the meaning behind those routines subtly eroded. Because traditions that once felt like natural extensions of social order now carried the weight of performance, upheld not because they were necessary, but because abandoning them felt like admitting the end of an era. And the staff, many of whom had devoted years or even lifetimes to the estate, sensed this shift long before it was openly acknowledged, as changes in scale, staffing levels, and maintenance priorities quietly reflected a more cautious approach to preservation rather than expansion. And this was the moment when the mansion's grandeur began to function as both an asset and a burden, admired for its beauty yet increasingly difficult to justify in practical terms. And as broader economic pressures reshaped American households of every size, the cost of maintaining a property designed for a different century became impossible to ignore, even for families accustomed to thinking in terms of permanence rather than balance sheets. And yet, despite these pressures, the estate did not immediately retreat into obscurity, because its symbolic power remained strong, drawing interest from historians, architects, and curious outsiders who saw in the mansion a physical record of an age that was rapidly receding into memory. And this growing awareness of historical value marked a subtle shift in how the mansion was perceived, both by those who lived within it and by those who encountered it from a distance. As it began to exist simultaneously as a private residence and an unspoken artifact, something that belonged not only to a family but to a broader narrative about American ambition and excess. And during this time, the surrounding community's relationship with the estate evolved as well, as newer generations viewed the mansion less as an employer or distant authority, and more as a landmark whose future mattered to the region's identity. And conversations that once would have seemed unthinkable began to circulate quietly, questions about preservation, adaptive use, and what responsibility, if any, the owners had to the public memory tied to the property. And while these ideas were rarely formalized, they reflected a growing tension between private ownership and cultural significance, a tension that estates like the Crocker Macmillan Mansion could no longer avoid indefinitely. And inside the house, spaces that once thrummed with social activity grew quieter, not abandoned but used more selectively, as rooms designed to impress large gatherings became backdrops for smaller, more restrained moments, reinforcing the sense that the mansion was transitioning from a living social engine into something more contemplative, almost introspective in character. And this quieting did not diminish the building's presence, but instead amplified its atmosphere, making its corridors feel heavier with accumulated history, as if the walls themselves were aware that they were outlasting the world that created them. And as decades advanced, the estate's connection to modernity became increasingly negotiated rather than assumed, with updates framed around preservation rather than innovation, reflecting a desire to protect the mansion's identity even as practical realities demanded adaptation. And this balancing act revealed a deeper truth about the estate, that its greatest strength, its scale and solidity, was also what made change so difficult, because altering anything significant felt like tampering with a carefully composed narrative. And so decisions were made cautiously, often deferred, allowing time to stretch, while the mansion stood in quiet defiance of urgency. And it was during this extended pause that the idea of legacy began to overshadow the idea of use, as conversations increasingly centered on what the mansion represented rather than how it functioned day to day. And this shift marked a critical turning point, because once a place is valued primarily for its symbolism, its future becomes a question not of comfort or convenience but of meaning. And as the Crocker Macmillan Mansion moved through this era of reflection and restraint, it carried forward the accumulated weight of its past, not yet transformed, but undeniably poised at the edge of a new chapter, one that would force it to reconcile its origins with a world that no longer built such things, yet could not quite bring itself to let them disappear. By the time the Crocker Macmillan Mansion entered what could best be described as its long reckoning period, the estate had become something of a paradox, still physically dominant within the Mahwah landscape, yet increasingly detached from the forces that once justified its existence. And this phase was defined by endurance rather than ambition, because the mansion was no longer shaping its environment but responding to it, adapting slowly and sometimes reluctantly to a world that had shifted its values away from inherited grandeur toward efficiency, transparency, and accessibility. And while the mansion remained meticulously cared for, that care now carried a different motivation, rooted less in display and more in stewardship, as if the building had quietly transitioned from a symbol of personal achievement into a responsibility that had to be managed with foresight and restraint. And this change in mindset was not abrupt or dramatic, but unfolded over years, reflected in smaller decisions that collectively signaled a deeper transformation, such as limiting large-scale alterations, prioritizing structural integrity over cosmetic updates, and viewing the estate through the lens of long-term survival rather than immediate relevance. And during this time, the mansion increasingly attracted attention, not for the lifestyle it enabled, but for the story it embodied. As historians and preservation-minded observers began to recognize it as a rare and largely intact example of a particular moment in American architectural and social history. And this recognition introduced a new kind of pressure, because once a private residence becomes historically significant, its future is no longer entirely its owner's to decide, even if legally it remains so. And this unspoken obligation added complexity to every discussion about the estate's direction. As any change carried implications beyond personal preference, touching on questions of cultural memory and public interest, and the mansion's isolation, once a mark of exclusivity, now amplified its aura of mystery, making it feel less like a home and more like a preserved fragment of another time, suspended just outside the reach of modern life. And yet, despite this growing sense of separation, the estate did not fade into irrelevance, because its very resistance to change made it compelling in an era defined by rapid turnover and disposable architecture. And people who encountered the mansion often described it not merely as impressive, but as unsettling in its permanence, as if it challenged the assumption that progress always required replacement. And within the house, this tension manifested in the way spaces were experienced, with rooms carrying the quiet authority of continuity. Unchanged not because they could not be altered, but because altering them felt unnecessary, even inappropriate. And this stillness became part of the mansion's identity, reinforcing the idea that its value lay in what it preserved rather than what it produced. And as time moved forward, discussions about the estate increasingly centered on preservation strategies, potential partnerships, and long-term planning that extended beyond any single generation. Reflecting an awareness that the mansion's lifespan was no longer tied to the fortunes or desires of one family alone, and this shift marked a subtle but profound change, because it reframed ownership as custodianship, a role defined by obligation rather than privilege. And while this perspective carried its own burdens, it also offered a form of purpose, allowing the mansion to justify its continued existence in a world that no longer built such structures. And the surrounding community's relationship with the estate deepened during this period as well, as it came to be seen not just as a relic of wealth, but as a point of continuity within a rapidly changing region, a physical anchor to a shared past that had shaped the area's development. And this growing sense of collective attachment further complicated decisions about the mansion's future, because any outcome would resonate beyond the property's boundaries, influencing how history itself was framed and remembered. And as the Crocker Macmillan Mansion continued through this era of reassessment, it stood not as a monument frozen in time, but as a living question, asking what it meant for a structure built on the assumptions of permanence to find relevance in an age defined by change. And it was this unresolved tension, more than any single event, that defined the mansion's ninth phase, setting the stage for the difficult choices and transformations that still lay ahead. As the Crocker Macmillan Mansion moved further into the latter decades of the 20th century, its existence became defined by negotiation with time itself, as the structures that had once symbolized unchallenged authority and wealth now confronted the relentless pressures of aging, changing social expectations, and evolving economic realities. And this period was less about dramatic upheaval and more about the painstaking management of continuity, because every decision, from roofing repairs to heating system updates, had to balance historical integrity against practical necessity, and the estate's custodians became adept at navigating these competing demands, often relying on detailed assessments, historical documentation, and expert consultation to determine which interventions preserved the mansion's essence while addressing urgent structural concerns. And this approach reflected a broader cultural shift in how historic estates were perceived, moving from private grandeur to public legacy, as preservationists, architectural historians, and regional planners increasingly recognized the mansion not merely as a residence, but as a rare surviving artifact of early 20th century ambition and design. And this recognition introduced new forms of scrutiny and accountability, as alterations and restorations were now evaluated not just for comfort or aesthetics, but for their adherence to the principles and character established at the mansion's creation. And within this context, the mansion's scale and complexity became both a challenge and an asset, as its sheer size required significant resources to maintain, but also ensured that its architectural and historical features were preserved in ways that smaller properties could not emulate. And the grounds, which had long functioned as an extension of the house's symbolic power, became increasingly valued for their environmental as well as aesthetic significance, as mature trees, water features, and design vistas reflected the original intent of integrating architecture and landscape, while also providing a rare ecological buffer in a region experiencing suburban expansion. And these dual values strengthened arguments for preservation, creating opportunities for partnerships with conservation organizations and historical societies, though such collaborations demanded careful negotiation to reconcile private ownership with public interest. And internally, the mansion's function continued to evolve, with some rooms shifting from active use to curated display, emphasizing their historical significance over daily practicality. And this subtle transformation reinforced the mansion's role as both a home and a living document of its era, where personal history and collective memory intersected. And yet, even as the estate assumed this quasi-public identity, the pressures of maintenance and adaptation remained, as deferred repairs accumulated and modern codes required upgrades that challenged the mansion's original construction, and each intervention carried the risk of compromising authenticity, forcing careful deliberation and often creative solutions that blended contemporary technology with historical materials and methods. And this period also highlighted the tension between legacy and change, as owners and stewards grappled with the reality that preserving the mansion intact required decisions that would inevitably alter its character in small but meaningful ways. And these choices underscored the delicate balance between honoring the past and accommodating the present, as every intervention had to respect the mansion's original vision while ensuring its survival for future generations. And outside the estate, public perception continued to evolve, as the mansion became a symbol of local history, architectural achievement, and cultural continuity, generating interest from scholars, students, and visitors. And this attention, while largely positive, also introduced new obligations, as the mansion now had to exist in dialogue with a wider audience whose expectations could influence its management. And through it all, the house remained a silent witness to the passage of time, its walls absorbing decades of change while steadfastly maintaining the visual and symbolic cues of its original design. And the mansion's endurance became a testament not just to its physical construction, but to the careful, deliberate stewardship that had guided it through fluctuating social, economic, and cultural landscapes. And as the 10th phase of its history unfolded, it became increasingly clear that the Crocker Macmillan Mansion story was not simply about survival, but about adaptation, interpretation, and the negotiation of value in a world that no longer built such monumental private residences. A story that would continue to evolve as each choice reinforced its significance, shaped its future, and ensured that it remained both a place and a narrative, bridging generations and preserving the ambitions of an era long past. As the Crocker Macmillan Mansion approached what could be considered the penultimate stage of its early history, the estate's presence in Mahwah became increasingly emblematic of the delicate balance between preservation and transformation, because by this time, the mansion was no longer simply a residence, but a repository of memory, culture, and architectural ambition, and its continued existence depended as much on careful decision-making as on the sturdiness of stone and timber. And during this period, the mansion's narrative began to absorb layers of interpretation from multiple perspectives, as historians, local officials, conservationists, and community members all contributed to an evolving understanding of its significance. And this pluralization of meaning created a unique challenge, because what one group saw as an essential feature to preserve, another viewed as a potential impediment to adaptation or accessibility. And negotiating these differing priorities required both diplomacy and an appreciation of the mansion's intangible qualities, qualities that could not easily be measured in dollars or square footage. And internally, the mansion continued to function as a living environment, though the character of that life had subtly shifted, as spaces that were once bustling with activity had become quieter, more reflective, and in some cases repurposed to serve the dual purpose of maintaining utility while signaling historical continuity. And this careful management of space highlighted the way the mansion had evolved from a personal statement of wealth into an artifact with broader cultural responsibilities. And as caretakers and family members wrestled with questions of modernization versus authenticity, the physical estate itself began to take on a new form of influence, shaping conversations about heritage, stewardship, and the ethical obligations of owning a property of such historical weight. And these discussions extended beyond the mansion's walls, influencing the surrounding community's perception of its identity, with Mahwah residents increasingly regarding the estate not simply as a private enclave, but as a touchstone for regional history, architectural taste, and environmental consideration. And this growing communal awareness added pressure to maintain not just the house but its broader landscape, including gardens, pathways, and water features, all of which contributed to the mansion's overall narrative and reinforced its symbolic presence within the area. And during this period, attention to documentation became especially pronounced, with surveys, photographs, and detailed records capturing the mansion's interiors, exteriors, and auxiliary structures, ensuring that even subtle details of craftsmanship were preserved in case of loss or necessary modification. And this meticulous record-keeping reflected a recognition that the mansion's survival was as much about knowledge and memory as it was about stone and wood, because the cultural and historical capital embedded in those details carried implications far beyond their material presence. And as public interest continued to rise, the estate occasionally opened its grounds for controlled educational or cultural events, allowing visitors to experience a portion of its history while preserving the mansion's integrity. And these events highlighted the challenges inherent in balancing access with conservation, as any increase in foot traffic or exposure introduced new risks to materials that were already aging. And even as these initiatives took shape, the mansion's narrative remained deeply tied to its original conception, with architectural lines, room proportions, and landscape design continuing to convey the ambition and taste of the era that had birthed it. And walking through the estate, one could still sense the hierarchy of spaces, the interplay of public and private areas, and the careful orchestration of views and entrances, all of which spoke to a level of intentionality that modern houses rarely attempted. And this awareness reinforced the mansion's dual identity, functioning simultaneously as an operational residence and as a living record of a particular social and architectural moment. And beyond aesthetics, practical concerns continued to shape the estate, with aging infrastructure, maintenance of mechanical systems, and seasonal management of the grounds requiring ongoing expertise and resource allocation. And these necessities underscored the mansion's status as a project in continuous management rather than a static artifact, a reality that became increasingly evident as caretakers confronted the limitations of labor, materials, and funding. And even as these challenges accumulated, the mansion's enduring presence served as a stabilizing force, a tangible reminder that certain structures, when carefully nurtured, could withstand not only physical decay, but also shifts in cultural and social context. And this combination of fragility and resilience made the estate a compelling case study in long-term stewardship, as well as a symbol of the tensions inherent in maintaining historical authenticity while accommodating contemporary realities. And as the 11th phase of its history unfolded, the Crocker Macmillan Mansion stood at the intersection of memory, adaptation, and foresight, poised to enter its final chapter in this early sequence, a chapter that would demand reckoning with both accumulated legacy and future possibility, and would ultimately test the ways in which preservation, interpretation, and lived experience could coexist within a property of such magnitude, complexity, and historical resonance. By the time the Crocker Macmillan Mansion entered what can be considered its 12th phase, the estate had begun to occupy a new conceptual space, no longer solely defined by private ownership or the ambitions of its original builders, but increasingly framed by questions of cultural responsibility, legacy, and the interplay between history and modernity. And this period was characterized by an intensified awareness that every decision regarding the property, whether about maintenance, use, or alteration, carried implications far beyond the immediate needs of those living or working within it, because the mansion had evolved into both a symbol and a repository of collective memory, embodying the aspirations, tastes, and social hierarchies of an era that was rapidly receding from direct experience. And this awareness permeated all aspects of life on the estate, shaping approaches to infrastructure, interior preservation, landscaping, and the careful orchestration of spaces in ways that emphasized continuity and authenticity. And as attention to the mansion's historical significance grew, both informal and formal mechanisms of stewardship were implemented, including cataloging architectural details, monitoring environmental conditions, and consulting with experts in preservation, art history, and landscape architecture to ensure that interventions were thoughtful and aligned with the mansion's established character. And this period also saw a subtle but important shift in the mansion's role within the surrounding community, as Mahwah residents, historians, and regional planners increasingly recognized the estate as a landmark whose influence extended beyond its immediate property lines, shaping local identity, tourism, and cultural discourse. And in response, the mansion's custodians began navigating a delicate balance between private discretion and public expectation, negotiating how much access, information, or interpretive programming could be offered without compromising the integrity of the property or the privacy of its inhabitants. And within the mansion itself, daily life continued to reflect a duality between operational functionality and historical reflection, as rooms remained in use for contemporary living or work while simultaneously being appreciated as preserved artifacts. And this duality required careful management, with staff, family, and consultants working in concert to address maintenance needs, implement conservation practices, and manage the estate's presentation to the outside world. And the gardens and grounds, long a defining feature of the estate's identity, similarly required ongoing stewardship that balanced ecological sustainability, aesthetic vision, and historical fidelity, because the landscape itself contributed to the mansion's narrative, offering a physical and symbolic extension of the architectural intent that had guided its creation. And as decades progressed, these layers of stewardship increasingly highlighted the mansion's role as a bridge between generations, connecting contemporary observers to the ambitions, lifestyles, and values of those who had conceived and constructed the property. And this intergenerational dialogue became particularly pronounced as educational and cultural programs were selectively introduced, providing structured opportunities for visitors to engage with the mansion's history while maintaining control over the preservation of its delicate interiors. And these programs emphasized interpretation as much as experience, encouraging reflection on architectural choices, landscape design, and the social context of the estate's origins, while simultaneously reinforcing the mansion's identity as a living, managed environment rather than a static museum. And even as the estate operated in this interpretive mode, practical concerns remained constant, because the scale of the property ensured that maintenance, security, and environmental control were never trivial matters, and each intervention had to be carefully considered for both immediate impact and long-term consequences, with attention to detail spanning from structural reinforcements to the careful preservation of decorative finishes. And the cumulative effect of these efforts was a mansion that projected both endurance and intentionality, asserting its presence in a changing world while demonstrating the value of sustained, thoughtful stewardship. And through this phase, the Crocker Mansion began to illustrate larger truths about historical properties more generally, particularly the challenges inherent in balancing private ownership, public interest, and the ethical obligation to preserve cultural memory. And this balancing act underscored the mansion's unique position at the intersection of time, materiality, and narrative, as each decision reflected not only practical necessity, but also a commitment to maintaining the dialogue between past and present. And in doing so, the mansion became a locus where historical inquiry, architectural conservation, and lived experience converged, offering insight into how monumental estates can persist and remain meaningful despite the pressures of evolving social, economic, and environmental realities. And as the 12th phase progressed, it became clear that the mansion's significance extended beyond aesthetics or wealth, encompassing ideas of responsibility, cultural stewardship, and the transmission of knowledge across generations, a recognition that would frame the final 2 phases of its story, where accumulated history and future possibility would come together to define the estate's enduring legacy. By the time the Crocker Mansion entered its 13th phase, the estate had firmly established itself as a nexus of historical significance, social memory, and architectural achievement, and the focus of this era shifted toward ensuring that the mansion's accumulated narrative could be communicated and preserved without compromising its structural integrity or the lived experience of those still occupying or managing it. And this phase was defined by a heightened consciousness of the mansion as both a temporal and spatial artifact, because every element of design, from floor plans and room proportions to decorative motifs and exterior facades, served as evidence of the ambitions and values of the early 20th century, and the responsibility to maintain these elements required increasingly sophisticated methods of documentation, conservation, and interpretation. And the mansion's custodians became adept at navigating the challenges inherent in preserving a property of such scale and complexity, employing detailed inventories, photographic archives, and architectural drawings to monitor condition, guide repairs, and anticipate the long-term needs of both structure and landscape. And as the mansion continued to age, the tension between permanence and vulnerability became more apparent. Because the estate's sheer size and the intricacy of its design magnified the impact of environmental stress, wear, and changing regulatory requirements, and addressing these challenges demanded an understanding of both historical construction techniques and modern engineering solutions, blending traditional craftsmanship with contemporary technology to maintain continuity while ensuring safety and functionality. And this careful integration of past and present reflected a broader ethos that had come to define the mansion's identity, one in which preservation was inseparable from interpretation, and historical significance was inseparable from practical management. And as the surrounding community grew and evolved, the mansion's presence became a point of orientation and cultural reference, influencing local perceptions of history, architecture, and social hierarchy. Because for many residents, the estate was not only a landmark, but a symbol of the region's transformation over decades, from rural landscapes to suburban development. And this evolving context created both opportunities and responsibilities, as the estate's custodians were called upon to consider the mansion's role within the broader social, economic, and environmental fabric of Mahwah. And internal operations reflected a delicate balance, with certain areas maintained for active use, while others were stabilized or curated to communicate the mansion's historical narrative, allowing visitors, researchers, or family members to experience the estate as both a living environment and a structured record of its era. And during this period, programming and selective public engagement became increasingly central to the mansion's function, with carefully managed tour, educational initiatives, and cultural events providing insight into the estate's architecture, history, and landscape design, while ensuring that these interactions did not compromise the preservation of delicate interiors or aging materials. And this careful calibration of access, use, and conservation underscored the mansion's dual identity as a residence and a historical artifact, requiring management strategies that were both proactive and anticipatory. And as the mansion's story continued to unfold, the grounds became an equally important component of its narrative, as mature plantings, gardens, pathways, and vistas illustrated the original design intentions and conveyed a sense of the estate's intended scale and aesthetic philosophy, while also serving as a living ecological system that required ongoing attention to maintain stability, beauty, and historical accuracy. And the integration of architecture and landscape in this phase highlighted the mansion's holistic design, reinforcing the principle that the environment surrounding the house was as meaningful as the structure itself. And this understanding informed both conservation practices and interpretive strategies, emphasizing continuity and fidelity to the estate's original vision. And over time, the mansion increasingly became a reference point for architectural scholars, preservationists, and students, who studied its details to understand construction techniques, stylistic choices, and the social context of its creation. And this scholarly attention further elevated the estate's cultural significance. positioning it as a case study in long-term stewardship, adaptive management, and the ethical responsibilities associated with preserving large-scale historic properties. And as the 13th phase progressed, the Crocker-Macmillan Mansion's identity solidified around this intersection of past and present, memory and management, public interest and private care, serving as a model for how estates of its scale could remain relevant, functional, and respected within a modern context, while still preserving the rich narrative and material evidence of their original era. And this stage of the mansion's life set the foundation for the final chapter in its story, a chapter that would synthesize the accumulated history, ongoing stewardship, and interpretive vision into a culmination that would define the estate's enduring legacy for generations to come. As the Crocker-Macmillan Mansion entered its final documented phase, the estate's long evolution reached a moment of synthesis, where decades of careful stewardship, historical interpretation, and adaptive management converged to define its enduring significance. And this period was less about immediate change than about understanding the mansion as a fully realized artifact whose meaning was layered, multifaceted, and intertwined with both private experience and public history. And by now, the estate had achieved a delicate equilibrium, balancing preservation, use, and cultural engagement in ways that allowed it to maintain integrity without becoming a static monument. And this balance was the result of careful planning, extensive documentation, and a recognition that each action, no matter how small, carried weight in shaping the mansion's legacy. Because the materials, design choices, and spatial arrangements were all expressions of a specific social, economic, and aesthetic context that had to be honored even as the world outside continued to change. And within the mansion itself, the interaction between living space and historical artifact became seamless, as rooms designed for daily activity were maintained and modernized in ways that respected original proportions, finishes, and decorative schemes, allowing the building to function as a home while simultaneously serving as a tangible record of its era. And this integration extended to the broader landscape, where gardens, paths, water features, and vistas were carefully managed to preserve the original design intentions while accommodating ecological and environmental realities. And this approach highlighted the mansion's holistic conception, emphasizing that architecture, interior design, and landscape were inseparable components of the estate's narrative. And as public interest continued to grow, the mansion's custodians skillfully negotiated access, interpretation, and conservation, allowing visitors, researchers, and scholars to engage with its history without compromising the structural or material integrity of the property. And in doing so, the estate became a focal point for understanding early 20th century architecture, the social dynamics of wealth, and the evolving practices of historic preservation. And the mansion's story also became a model for other large-scale historic properties, demonstrating how careful planning, attention to detail, and commitment to authenticity could enable a property to remain relevant and meaningful in a modern context. And through all of these processes, the Crocker-Macmillan Mansion maintained its dual identity, existing both as a functional residence and as a curated historical site, bridging the gap between lived experience and historical interpretation. And this duality underscored the complexity of stewarding such a property, because decisions about repairs, updates, and use were never neutral but always implicated the mansion's narrative and its symbolic presence within the community. And as the estate matured into the 21st century, it became clear that its significance extended beyond aesthetics or scale, encompassing notions of responsibility, cultural continuity, and the transmission of knowledge across generations. And this awareness influenced every aspect of management, from staffing and maintenance to programming and public engagement, ensuring that each intervention reinforced the mansion's identity rather than diminishing it. And the surrounding community's relationship with the estate likewise evolved, as Mahwah residents, historians, and visitors increasingly regarded the mansion not merely as a private home, but as a locus of memory, a symbol of architectural ambition, and a touchstone for understanding the region's development. And this recognition added a layer of communal responsibility to the mansion's stewardship, reinforcing the idea that preservation was both a private duty and a public service. And internally, the mansion continued to reflect the values and intentions of its creators, with spaces that conveyed hierarchy, social function, and aesthetic vision, while also accommodating modern necessities, creating an environment where historical fidelity and contemporary functionality coexisted. And these dynamics were mirrored in the estate's landscape, which preserved sightlines, garden structures, and designed vistas, reinforcing the mansion's visual and symbolic coherence. And together, house and grounds presented a comprehensive narrative where architecture, interior design, landscape, and historical interpretation converged to convey the story of ambition, refinement, and legacy. And as this final phase unfolded, the Crocker Macmillan Mansion stood as a testament not only to the vision of its original owners, but to the dedication of generations of caretakers who had navigated the complex challenges of preservation, adaptation, and interpretation, ensuring that the estate remained a living, relevant, and meaningful site. And in this culmination, the mansion's story demonstrated how a property could survive the passage of time without losing its identity, balancing memory, utility, and cultural significance. And the legacy of the Crocker Macmillan Mansion ultimately became a case study in endurance, stewardship, and the interplay between past and present, showing how careful management, thoughtful preservation, and an awareness of historical responsibility could allow a monumental estate to continue shaping understanding and inspiring appreciation long after its original builders had passed, leaving behind a fully realized narrative that would resonate for generations. As both a home and a historic artifact, and as the mansion settled into this final phase, it did so with a sense of purpose, continuity, and affirmation that its story, meticulously preserved and carefully interpreted, would endure as a living testament to ambition, taste, and the complex legacies of American estates.